So much, Ms Rees, and thank the Business Committee for allowing me to make this statement on our report, Access to Cash in Scotland, which we duly published on Monday. And it's great to see so many colleagues from Scottish constituencies and right across Scotland here today, and I'm looking forward to the questions that they're going to ask on this report. And, of course, Northern Ireland. How can I possibly forget the honourable gentleman? Ms Rees, we know that this is an issue that continues to concern many of our constituents and impacts on some of the most marginal and vulnerable people that we represent. And the Scottish Affairs Committee has taken a long-term interest in this as an issue. And our predecessor committee has released a report back in 2018 when we looked at this in the round and made a number of conclusions and recommendations and duly published them to government. We also have taken an interest in banking infrastructure right across Scotland. And again, we've had reports and had sessions on that very issue again in the course of the past few years. This inquiry, we took evidence from representative groups and organisations, and we invited members of the public to complete a public survey on access to cash in Scotland and to note their own experiences and views on the issue. We would, of course, like to thank everyone who contributed to our investigation, as well as those who responded to our public survey. Ms Rees, one of the key recommendations of a previous report when we published in 2018 was that the government considered legislating to ensure communities continued to have access to vital banking services. We are therefore delighted and pleased that the government has done just that by including a bill to ensure that happens in the Queen's speech. The Financial Services and Markets Bill is a positive development and constructive response to the efforts of this committee and the many representations that have been made from colleagues from right across the House. If we have any disappointments about the bill, it's maybe a bit too late, and we've lost many aspects of our banking infrastructure in the intervening years. But we understand, of course, that the government want to take a wide and all-inclusive consultation prior to announcing their bill. But it does concern us that we have lost so many bank branches in the course of the intervening years, and we know that now banks are considering rushing bank closures ahead of any bill and legislation being passed by the House. But, Ms Rees, it's certainly the case that the picture looks considerably different from when the previous committee investigated access to cash. The pandemic has changed everything, and there's been a continued rush to digitalisation and to continued use of digital facilities for personal banking and business banking. The pandemic has accelerated this move, but cash payments still account for the second most used form of payments and represent 70% of all transactions. Currently, 5.4 million people, or about 10% of UK adults, are reliant on cash. In Scotland, this is equivalent to around 500,000 people, 500,000 of our over 5 million population. In 2019, the Access to Cash Review found that over 8 million adults, or 17% of the UK population, would struggle to cope in a cashless society. And this was also reflected in the public survey that I mentioned in my introductory remarks. The majority of our respondents held very negative views over the potential for the UK to become a cashless society. 67% of those that responded to our survey told us they thought it would be very negative if the UK became a cashless society. The other thing that, of course, concerned our committee is the sheer volume of bank closures that we've seen across the UK and specifically in Scotland in the course of the past few years. Since 2015, Scotland has lost 53% of its bank branches, and we've experienced the greatest percentage of loss out of all the UK nations. And if you look at the ATM network, it's just as bad, with 20% of Scotland's free-to-use ATMs closing since 2018. Now, obviously, the banking industry have contributed to this report and inquiry, and what they've told us that they're merely responding to falling customer demand, and they further told us that many bank branches and ATMs are no longer commercially viable. And I think all of us understand, appreciate and respect the fact that many more people are taking advantage of the very useful digital services that are now available to each and every single one of us. But what we have found, Ms Rees, is, and we were told by Which, that the impact of these bank branch and ATM closures can be most severe in remote and rural areas of Scotland due to challenges around connectivity. And it's often the case that people must travel further distances to access the nearest cash access point, and I'm pretty certain that honourable members will want to raise that issue with me this afternoon. which has also told us that COVID-19 pandemic had resulted in an increase in the number of retailers refusing to accept cash as a form of payment. And there's no doubt that the pandemic has forced a number of businesses to adapt and accelerate the move to digital payments. And there's also now the cost of living crisis which comes on top of this. We heard in evidence that increases in the cost of living crisis may result in more people choosing to use cash to manage their finances for budgeting reasons. However, we were told that there's limited publicly available data on retail cash acceptance. The report of an increase in the number of retailers refusing to accept cash is also concerning. So we therefore have recommended in our report that the UK Government should consider asking the Financial Conduct Authority to investigate and monitor cash acceptance levels across the UK. We also know in our report that the banking industry has undertaken several impressive initiatives to protect consumers' access to cash. One example is Link's Financial Inclusion Programme, which ensures that the most rural and deprived areas in the UK continue to have access to cash, and that effort is very welcome. However, the programme's successes rely on the voluntary membership of card issuers and ATM operators. So again, in our report, we have recommended that the UK Government mandate the membership of Link for both card issuers and ATM operators to ensure that Link's initiatives are not simply enacted on the voluntary basis that they are today. We've also heard about the benefits that the introduction of universal deposit-taking ATMs would bring to both consumers and particularly businesses across Scotland. This sort of infrastructure would assist in the sustainability of the ATM network while providing a secure location for customers and businesses to deposit cash. However, attempts to introduce the infrastructure have been constrained by lack of progress by both the UK Government and the banking industry. Our predecessor committee considered deposit-taking ATMs, and we repeat our predecessor's committee recommendation that the UK Government set up a working group with industry to introduce a network-wide deposit-taking ATMs. And lastly, Ms Rees, throughout our inquiry we heard about the substantial role of the Post Office in its increasing use of banking services, and it continues to provide consumers and businesses with access to basic cash and banking facilities. And despite the positive interventions taken by both the banking industry and the Post Office, the current provision of cash via the Post Office rests on the short-term and voluntary banking framework agreement. We therefore, in our report, have recommended that the UK Government seek a long-term commitment from the banks to maintain appropriate banking services for their customers using the Post Office network. The committee, of course, as I've said in my earlier remarks, welcomes very much the Government's commitment to protecting access to cash through legislation. We now are concerned about measures may be required in the period that will last now between now and when that bill is going to be introduced and legislation enacted. We look forward to working with Government to ensure that this bill is a success when it's introduced.